apartment in New York, London and Paris, where we restaurant, living on top of it. It's all that we have here, songs of regret, and no one is willing to share it. What can we see? Unfortunately, living is legendary. Blaming this man in the cuts all the time, knowing that nothing is happening at all. Come along, fool. Left away, here the senses, you're disconnected. It's not that it's bad, it's not that it's dead. It's just on the tip of your tongue, so sadly wanting to let you laugh all the time, sitting alone without seeing how crying. Children with kids and people with parents, any which ways get past your presence. When the day comes and all of the minds, we are revealing shooting persons. Come along, fool. Did you let head of the senses, you're disconnected. It's not that it's bad, it's not that it's good. It's just that it's on the tip of your tongue. You're so sad when it's alright, the baby's love. Half of it's misunderstanding now. The worry and wondering again, with ourselves and with our friends. Come along, fool. Are you ready? Hear the senses are disconnected. It's not that it's bad, it's not that it's good. It's just that it's on to your tongue. It's so sad.
So that's a nice song, Full by Cat Power. The most of the lyrics don't really mean that much to me. It's I don't know, it's a list of details. But the song in general conveys, you know, a kind of sad, very sad sympathy for fools like me, I suppose. So it's very touching and sweet song. And one word that does stand out is the word disconnected, because certainly, I have been quite disconnected and isolated from other people in many ways. Not not primarily on a physical level, although there definitely is that a lot, in fact. But at a psychological and a spiritual level, and that was already present with me before. I was a big thinker, and I lived in my own head. Not that I was kind of unaware um, or particularly insensitive to what was going on around me. I was completely aware. It really, but I wasn't interested. Um, I was never very interested in my external environment. Um, Instead, um, I was usually busy, working some kind of ideas out in my head. Usually would be some kind of philosophical idea, either about metaphysics. About. It could be anything, and generally through my earlier kind of attempts, at kind of thinking things through when I was younger. Um, Even when I came into contact with, the works of philosophy, and to a large extent, my head was quite confused. It was very confused, and I although I made some, real progress and insight, which I think other people, didn't have. On the other hand, there was still a lot of intellectual kind of confusion going on with me. And whereas I suppose most people don't really take philosophy and ideas that seriously, so they're unlikely to be kind of actually stopped in their tracks and unable to get on with life because of some kind of abstract linguistic confusion, or maybe, I don't know, one thing which some people would actually be bothered by is the problem of nihilism and objective value in the world. For me, that was a very big one, but most people generally would not be impeded in their ordinary life to the extent, well, to any extent, really, most people, but the natural born philosophers would be. And I was to a very large extent. I felt that, my feeling has always been, in particular when I was younger, is that these kind of philosophical and intellectual problems are absolutely of crucial central importance, and that it's totally negligent, or impossible, at least impossible for me, to to just get on with life, apart from these problems, or trying to solve these problems. And as you can imagine, from the people around me, my parents, and then society in general, this kind of obsession with certain kind of philosophical conundrums to give an example, I suppose, one could take solipsism, and the idea that, the problem of other minds, that is something that can just drive one absolutely, loopy or crazy, trying to work it out. And there are lots of others which are probably not so obvious, which cause me a lot of problems. And just the fact that I was so obsessed with these kind of things, by itself makes me very disconnected from other people. But then when psychiatry, starts involving itself with you, and if it actually sections you and labels you seriously mentally ill or mentally ill at all, then that by itself is about the most isolating and disconnecting experience that probably anybody can ever encounter. Because the whole world pretends if it's something which it isn't. So you are very, very isolated spiritually and emotionally and psychologically, because as I say, about 40 or 50,000 people a year in the UK alone are forcibly detained under the Mental Health Act, and it's going up every year. So by definition, these people are, really protesting and thinking that, it's not good for them, and their interpretation of the situation is usually or always very different from the people around them. Because if one stops using euphemisms and simply calls a spade, what it actually is a state kidnapping. It's taking you hostage against your will, in a state facility, which isn't necessarily or in any way less psychologically damaging or harmful than a real kidnap situation. I mean, just because it's the government, that wouldn't. Well, why would that make it less psychologically traumatic? It's the same logical structure to what is actually occurring here. Somebody being so. Yes, but then society and psychiatrists use all these euphemisms, and they smile at you, pretending to be totally unaware and unknowing of the this is in fact a kind of state kidnap, and they gaslight you for that, for saying that this is wrong what you're doing to me. So that is really, an incredible experience when you're going through it. The whole world just does literally seem crazy and very wicked and malicious. It's because to do that a person really does require a very lax and effective conscience. So yeah, so I mean, this is how isolating it is. I mean, it's by the very fact of being sectioned, you become an outlaw. It puts you completely a loggerhead with society. I mean, these people, these people are, all the people sectioned, including me, were obviously already, somewhat troubled, very troubled, in many ways, and struggling to fit in with normal society. And then suddenly, they come down like a ton of bricks on you and make you into a Fisher outcast and outlaw, sorry, at total 180 degrees loggerheads with society. because, you know, if you were already kind of questioning and kind of not particularly impressed with the rest of society, you know, the vast majority of people then, you know, who this happens to, they are forcibly detained. That is going to obviously radicalize their antagonism and sense of injustice and rebellion, as opposed as regards the whole of society. Um, um, and and then there's the constant culture of denial. You know, not just at the time, but, you know, for years later, or for the whole of your lifetime later. You know that um, you know that they're still not prepared to call a spade, and that, you know, you were grossly violated. Um, in my case, it was especially bad because it actually did me very, very material damage. When I say material, I don't mean, you know, literally like it broke my arm or something, but I mean in a in regards to my nervous system or my spirit, my spirituality, and these things are obviously, you know, deeply entwined. And I don't know the exact material basis of what occurred, but I know that it did me very, very substantial damage and harm. Like I say, it completely destroyed and caused the last 12 or 13 years of my life the absolute agony. um, you know, it can't be overstressed, and nobody will ever understand or believe, or even, you know, they won't. People people don't want to believe me, you know, and they don't care. You know, it wasn't their life, and I can't, you know, I can't somehow magically transmit it into their brains, you know, what happened to me, into their minds. Um, um, so, you know, it's in my case, it is particularly isolating and particularly bad um, because of the very, very real damage that did me. Um, and while it is likely, and in fact, you know, scientifically and statistically well evidenced that it does do a lot of damage to a lot of the people it happens to, both psychological and, you know, and in fact health wise. Uh, um, Obviously, the more damage it actually does, the more isolating as well that experience is going to be, and the more sense of grievance and anger that it is going to accompany it. Uh, uh, so, you know, in the case of most people, I mean, like I said, it's literally kidnapped. So, I mean, um, you know, if your will is violated to that extent, you know, even if you're in a fairly okay state, you know, not as vulnerable and precarious as I was in. Um, but it should be said that most people who this does happen to are in a very vulnerable, precarious position, and that's exactly what happens. Um, but, you know, let's say you're not in quite as fragile and precarious situation as I was in, then, you know, it's still going to be a great kind of, you know, uh, sense of violation. Um, um, I mean, let's say that, you know, someone kidnaps somebody else off the street and holds them hostage, you know, in their basement for 6 months. But, you know, they don't actually do anything, you know, concrete physical harm to them, and they, you know, they feed them reasonably okay. Um, Well, I mean, this is basically the same thing. I mean, why does the fact that it's the government who does it, I mean, lessen the psychological trauma? Why would it lessen that? I mean, it's simply setting one against the whole of society and making one feel the whole of society is one's enemy and dangerous, rather than just one rogue individual. Uh, um, I mean, and by definition, a lot of these people who this happens to, they don't have a particularly benign view of their government to start with, because this occurrence is linked with paranoid ideas about their government, and that the government is out to get them, etc., and that kind of thing. So, so they don't. A lot of these people, they don't have any benign notion of what's happening to them and their government at all. Anyway, um, so there isn't that fact to mitigate it. On the other hand, even if they do have a kind of a neutral perspective on their government until that point, well, the fact that the government is then violating them and violating their will to such a strong extent is very likely, to kind of to destroy any benign notions that they have had about their government until that point. So, they're not going to feel particularly secure. I mean, the thing is that I mean, it's an interesting comparison, and it's very interesting discussion. To compare, like I say, a random kidnapping off the street and state kidnapping, as in the case of psychiatry. It's worth going into more, and I haven't particularly gone into it explicitly in the book. Perhaps I will in these talks. Because I suppose that most people, if they had a neutral perspective of their government or of psychiatry, or a benign perspective, then they probably at least wouldn't feel that let's say their lives were in danger. So that's one possible difference. But the fact is that in many ways, being detained in a psychiatric hospital is itself, so bad, particularly if it does cause you, immediate suffering, like it did me, and it really knocks you off balance and causes you, genuine harm. Then, just being in that situation and then actually knowing that they can keep you like that forever, even if they're not going to kill you, they're not going to actually, explicitly kind of, do anything which is, totally outside the law or anything like that. But just the fact that they can hold you in one of these places, forever, and they can do this to anyone. So anybody who actually is detained in a psychiatric hospital, will be thinking like this, or at least they should be thinking like this. And then the fact that you are then chemically violated, it's again, it's impossible. It's almost impossible to overemphasize the severity of that abuse, of being chemically violated. Again, because they inject you with drugs, or they force you to actually, swallow the pills, totally against your will. I mean, if you don't swallow the pills, they will inject you. They will hold you down, wrestle you to the ground, and inject you. And that's exactly what happened to me. And this is a terrible, terrible violation, which it robs you of self-control and self-determination, because they're literally invading the innermost sanctum of your mind, of your soul, and manipulating it with these actually highly toxic chemicals. If you've never been on them, I mean, you can swallow the propaganda and the advertising. I don't know, perhaps that these are just kind of like some kind of insulin for diabetics. Yeah. But I mean, if you have actually been on them, I mean, or at least if they don't particularly agree with you, I mean, it's going to be different for different people, right? But I mean, the vast majority of people who are actually forced on these things, and I can tell you from my own personal first-hand experience, they literally torture you. I mean, with me, they cause me, pressure on my skull, like I was saying before, and this intensification of this great restlessness. They smell poisonous, they taste poisonous, and when you're on them, you feel poisoned. They're not like some kind of very delicate intervention, the biological mechanism to supply something the body was lacking or something like that. No, they're very crude and a crude form of intoxication, which interferes with the body's and the brain's smooth functioning in a way that renders you less articulate and able to voice your protest, and deprives you of your motivation and willfulness because you're in such an inner misery. So you're less able to protest and to act out because everything seems futile and you're filled with despair. That was my experience, and I've talked to other people, and they report similar things, and I could see when I was in there that most of the people were extremely demoralized by what was happening to them, and they felt the same way about the so-called medication. So this, is a gross invasion, which is it can't be overemphasized. I mean, it is. I mean, to compare it to rape, sexual rape would be, to not to overemphasize it in the slightest. It would be to, in fact, it's not a sufficient comparison, because in sexual rape, it's something which perhaps takes the course of minutes or hours. At most it would tend to be hours, and it's your cruder organs, in a sense, your sexual organs. I'm in no way condoning rape or anything like that. Yes, it's probably in the vast majority of cases, extremely traumatic, and if we can stamp it out, that's a good thing. But like I say, it's not even a sufficient comparison to what is actually happening, in psych wards all over the country, and what happened to me, because this isn't just for it's not just the moment they're holding you down and injecting you in the backside. It's every moment of the day for months or years on end, in which your mind has been corrupted, and invaded. The innermost sanctum of your being, of your soul. It's not just a physical part of your anatomy. It's being influenced and compelled against your will, and not just influenced and compelled, but very, very strongly degraded and ruined, depriving you of your actual your higher sentiments and faculties. Like I say, it's constant for months or years on end, potentially indefinite until you die. So this creates a state of extreme terror in the victim, whereby they feel that their life is over or potentially over, and they're going to be subjected to a lifelong torture of degradation internally, whereby all of their potential and all of their faculties are going to be just eroded away by these chemicals, suppressed and eroded away, slowly eroded away in silence and unmourned ignominy and disgrace. Potentially, their whole lives until they die, because once this happens to you, you are then 100% under the thumb of the psychiatrist who happens to be lording it over you, under whose jurisdiction you just happen to have fallen, and who then has, life and death power over you. I mean, not literally. Well, sometimes it can be literal, because these drugs do kill, and there are also terrible abuses that actually do happen in some psychiatric units. Not that I've particularly had that much first-hand experience of that, perhaps, but these things are reported, that there are actual abuses in these places, as well as the by the book abuses. There are also malpractices. So that can be scary as well, for people. But I'm not trying to emphasize that aspect, because to me it's not the illegal abuses and malpractices are significant. It's the way the whole system is a system of abuse and a system of torture. So yes, I mean, it creates a sense of terror in the victim, because you are then completely helpless and beholden to the mad doctor, who has already proven himself to be totally detached from reality and what is really happening to you. And yet you are totally under his thumb and, in the position of trying to convince him that you are, I don't know, you fit his criteria of acceptable. And if you don't, manage to deem yourself acceptable to him, and you don't also get a huge amount of luck, then the possibility that you will remain, drugged up and quite possibly, locked up, for years and years on end is very, 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 very realistic and very palpable. And it does happen to a lot of people. I was locked up in there for 6 months, although, I mean, my behavior, didn't change that much in those 6 months. I mean, I've been locked up for 6 months twice, in fact. And the second time I was locked up in particular, I mean, nothing really changed with me. It's like, they just hold you there for a certain amount of time, for good measure in their kind of in their measurement of the situation. And in fact, you feel worse as a result, as I've clearly explained already, possibly much, much worse, as I did. And then, but you learn to sort of like jump through a few of the hoops externally, so, you do a bit of your laundry, a few times a week, and you stop speaking out of turn, or saying things that they don't like. And, very little changes, a few complete superficialities. And, they keep you in there for 6 months. And then, if you're lucky, they may release you. But they may as well have just released you after 1 day, because the way it actually functions is simply as a kind of shock and as a warning that, like, society doesn't like what you're doing, and you need to alter your behavior, or you're going to be locked up here. So, basically, if they just did it for 1 day and then said, be careful now, this is what can happen to you, well, that would serve exactly the same purpose. And it wouldn't steal 6 months of the person's life. It's so insulting to be in that situation where you're being somehow assessed on the most trivial of criteria, and just held there against your will while you're pining for release, for no reason whatever. Simply because the doctor is such a power-wielding idiot, maniac. He refuses to actually understand or pay attention to what's really going on with you. So yes, I mean, if the idea of, like, I don't know, sudden death is frightening, would generally be quite frightening to people. In fact, far less things are very terrifying and frightening to most people. If they're going to get sacked in their job, well, that can cause a nervous breakdown. Some people, it's a lot less. But imagine the idea of being kind of trapped in this situation where you're being poisoned potentially for life. That's much worse than a death threat. At least if you're going to die, then it's going to be over in some extent. That's obviously that would be absolutely atrocious too. But imagine the living death that people do go through, and you could potentially be going through, if you're beholden to a doctor in this way, and you're sectioned. So yeah, I mean, it's a whole. It's not just one factor; it's a whole kind of trifecta, or I don't know. Synthesis of destruction. This whole process. So yeah, and then the whole world is in denial and refuses to acknowledge the harm that it's done to you, or doing to you. So that's why I say this is quite a disconnecting experience. It's quite an isolating experience. And with me, since like I say, it has done a very kind of intimate and a very concrete harm with me, which however I can't actually I can't prove or make others understand particularly, but it made me completely lose my bearings with regards to other people and my mental connection to other people, because before that I was always kind of like mapping out human psychology in my own mind, and like how I fit in with other people, and how their minds operate. And when this occurred, I completely lost all my bearings on that subject, and my own kind of like I say, my own kind of nervous system or spirituality in my mind was twisted and destroyed in a very unusual and unique, idiosyncratic way. And that means that I can no longer refine my bearings and retrace my connection to other people in the way that I was doing before. If somebody has like a rare condition of any kind, a physical illness even, or let's say, they lost both legs in the war or something like that, well, that puts them in a fairly rare situation that really separates them and is very isolating from other people. And those kind of more kind of obvious material factors, like I say, they're true with psychiatry as well, and being a patient of psychiatry. But when something really like goes wrong with your mind in a certain way, and a certain destruction takes place, which makes you somebody different from who you were before, that it is particularly isolating and disconnecting from your own identity of who you used to be, and from other people. And with me, I considered my ability to articulate my own experience and my own self and its relation to other people to be like one of my main life missions, because I wanted to be a writer, right? And I wanted to, write about psychology and about myself and about other people. Um, so this kind of understanding or intuition was especially important to me. And the trauma inflicted by psychiatry completely disorientated me from that point of view. So it prevented me from being able to do what I considered the redeeming, a mission, in my life at the time, which was precisely to understand and articulate these kind of things. So that's why, part of the reason that set me back like, over 12 years. Because, I'm only beginning to refine my bearings now. And it's not just that, that's just one aspect, more of a kind of side effect of the real damage. But like I say, I'm only really beginning to refine my bearings now and be able to articulate my situation in a way that gives me peace of mind. And the psychiatrist, totally oblivious. I mean, they couldn't even understand what I'm saying now. They have no actual interest or insight about psychology or higher human aspirations and needs. That what a writer really, what a writer's life is like, and the kind of conditions that are conducive to his success and flourishing. They don't have the slightest insight into these areas, nor the slightest interest. I mean, and yet these are the direct products of their actions, which I've been dealing for years and years and years, and will be dealing with the rest of my life. So we can see the unintended consequences of impulsive actions and skewed power relationships. Power being invested in people who have no real interest or the slightest clue or understanding of who they're dealing with, and making these enormously life-changing decisions, and not being held responsible for them. It could easily be the case that the average psychiatrist, I don't know, ruins three or four lives a day, on average, because and he never thinks twice about it or is any way considered responsible. He's just like on another plane, like I say in one of my poems, I don't know, like flustering through the wards, etc., on highly important, highly esteemed business. Mm. Yeah, so in the last down to the last 5 minutes of the video, I'll get back to my book. So I just point out that what I said was the cover last time is not in fact the cover. It's just the artwork at the beginning of the book. The cover is Nietzsche with various symbols juxtaposed around him, covering his face and things like that. And Yeah, and this is the cover that I've got here. You can see on Amazon. Just trying to explain bit of it briefly. At the middle, there's the mask of Dionysus. Dionysus was a Greek god of intoxication, ecstasy, and wine, and madness, who was symbolized, in fact, by the mask, um, which is an interesting fact that begs into some interpretation. I don't really have time for now. And then there's Nietzsche with devil horns on. I mean, because I don't know, obviously he was trying to refute Christianity, and he's a bit of a devil's advocate from a certain point of view. And then the moon, symbolizing lunacy, and there's a gaslight in the top left. Then the boomerang, and that symbolizes kind of karma. You know, things coming back to you, like maybe the accusation of being crazy, coming back to psychiatrists in the book. Then we got some drugged up, poor, pathetic poor people banging their heads against walls in the psychiatric ward, and the lion, symbolizing, I don't know, courage and righteous indignation and love. And then first do no harm, the Hippocratic Oath, which is a big joke in relative to psychiatry, and then there's an interesting one, which is a knee with the reflex reaction of the knee, and that's, I think, a very pertinent image, because that is how everybody responds to people with mental illness. They just they just respond on the most primitive reptile part of the brain, on they just react in the most unhealthy way, try and kind of shut you down and control you. And that's how people generally deal with each other in general. They don't kind of really anticipate, the needs of a human soul, or really try and understand or care for other people. They just react on reflex, when, I don't know, they seem a bit depressed or whatever, usually in a way which is counterproductive. At least that's my experience. And it's important to emphasize that spirituality, real spirituality and enlightenment, is to a large extent about kind of becoming less reactive and less reflexive, and achieving a deeper level of consciousness and a slower level of processing in lots of ways. It's a more considerate and thought and held back way of reacting or dealing with the world and other people, so that you don't just react and react reflexively. Let's say if somebody says something which you consider to be offensive or insulting, you don't just get out of their throats and get angry, like some kind of mug who can't control himself. But you approach things from a more considered and higher and detached level in many respects. So you kind of view the world from a distance. So although you may be present with other people, there's a longer kind of duration between the outside stimulus and the inward reaction or decision to act, that delayed response, and the ability to delay response is possibly, quite an important aspect of spirituality, and higher maturity, spiritual and emotional maturity. So, I mean, then the idea is that your reactions are kind of they're less instantaneous and they're more profound. And perhaps I'll try and get back to that point somewhere later, and think up a kind of good metaphor for what I'm talking about. It's a nice idea to leave the video on, and thank you for listening, and please keep watching my videos, and consider what I'm saying.